Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao. I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating the 7th Google Hangout session of the 4th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds towards our celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign, which aims to raise $1 million for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you a little more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project and how to help end violence against women. We've got plenty of primers and checklists and all. If you are a victim or survivor, or you know someone who is and you want to help them, just go to www.thepixelproject.net. We have a very special guest today. We are going to have a live discussion and Q&A session with the extremely talented and best-selling crime fiction author Alafair Burke. Alafair writes 2 series of crime novels. One series features NYPD detective ELLIE Hatcher, the other Portland, Oregon prosecutor Samantha Kincaid. Alafair's books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. A graduate of Stanford Law School and a former deputy district attorney in Portland, Oregon, Alafair is now a professor of law at Hofstra Law School, where she teaches criminal law and procedure. Alafair has also previously served as a trial lawyer prosecuting domestic violence offenses. So Alafair has also generously donated a fabulous book bundle to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels fundraising page. It comprises 5 Alafair Burke books, which are signed paperbacks, and 1 Mystery Writers of America tote bag. And the good news is that Alafair's book bundle has been snapped up by Faith Hull from Massachusetts. Thank you so much, Faith. And there are more goodies from other authors still available, and we'll tell you about them later on in this session. And right now, I will beam over to Alafair. Just a little content warning. Alafair is going to read a really intense chapter from her latest book, The Axe, and it will be about a mass shooting. So if you feel that that would trigger you, just go out, get a coffee for 10 minutes, chill out, come back in 10 minutes. We'll start the discussion about the books. Great female characters in Alafair's books, toxic masculinity, Alafair's work as prosecuting domestic violence offenses. Don't miss it. But yeah, so I will hand you over to Alafair now. Hi, Alafair. Good evening, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Regina. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to help.
Yeah. So you're going to read a chapter from your book, The Axe, right? The Axe is your latest book?
Right here, ready to go. You want me to just introduce it and start reading?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. Thanks. The Axe is my 11th novel, and the main character is a criminal defense attorney in New York named Olivia Randall. And at the beginning of the book, she receives a phone call from a teenage girl asking her, "You need to help my father." And she slowly pieces together that her father, the girl's father, is Jack Harris. And that is Olivia Randall's ex-fiance, hence the title, The Ex. And when she hears that Jack has been arrested, she's convinced it's got to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe it'll be a shoplifting case where he walked out without paying for something. But then she learns that it's a triple murder. And she's convinced Jack is innocent because even though they haven't seen each other for 20 years ago, she knew him like she'd never known anyone else. She's convinced he must be innocent, but then when she decides to help him, she realized the police have some evidence against him. And one of the pieces of evidence against him is the fact that one of the victims in the triple homicide is a man named Malcolm Neely. And the beginning of chapter 3 explains why that fact is significant, the relationship between Jack and this man named Malcolm Neely who's been murdered. Every generation of Americans had at least one day where they could all remember where they were when they heard the news. Pearl Harbor, the Kennedy assassination, 9/11. And then there were some dates that left the same kind of mark, but in a smaller and more regional way. Columbine in Colorado, the Federal Building in Oklahoma, the Marathon in Boston, a bell tower in Texas, riots in Los Angeles, a club fire in Rhode Island. For New York City, the most recent of those searing, scarring events was the Penn Station massacre. Until that morning, 3 years ago, we moved like cattle through the turnstiles and corridors of our crowded public transportation systems, complaining about delayed trains, bumped briefcases, or a fellow passenger in dire need of a shower. But then a mass shooting broke out in the heart of the city during peak commuting hours. What seemed unimaginable suddenly felt inevitable. 13 people dead, not to mention the wounded, or the shooter who fired a final bullet into his own jaw at the first sight of police coming his way, which was less than 2 minutes after the first sound of gunfire. Roughly one shot every 2 seconds for 108 seconds was the gruesome estimate later bandied about by the media. These weren't the only shocking details. The killer wasn't a foreign jihadist, as most of us assumed when we first heard about the attack. He was a local, and he wasn't even a man yet, just a boy, 15 years old, all of 5'7" and 127 pounds. His name was Todd. Todd didn't need physical size to inflict that kind of damage, not when he was armed with a Bushmaster rifle and 2 .40 caliber pistols, all 3 weapons semi-automatic. In the same way, I had not been able to stop myself from watching the constant replays of planes heading toward the Twin Towers. I had been glued to my television for consecutive days afterward, afraid to leave my apartment in the midst of warnings about feared copycat attacks. How did a 15-year-old boy have access to those kinds of weapons? Outraged and bewildered New Yorkers wanted to know. After another 24-hour news cycle, we began to have an answer to that question. Todd's mother, still clinically depressed despite 3 hospitalizations, killed herself when he was just 8 years old. Todd's older brother was nearly out of college at the time. Todd's father, determined that his younger son be treated normally, despite multiple assessments from teachers and counselors that he was anything but, resisted mental health treatment. He moved his son from school to school in search of a place that was willing to ignore Todd's behavioral and psychological problems. At the time of the shooting, Todd was enrolled at the Stinson Academy, apparently a last stop for rich screw-ups in the world of elite private schools. Instead of seeking help for his increasingly alienated and angry son, the father used his wealth to encourage activities that father and son might enjoy together, at least in the few minutes a week the father could spare for his son. Yankees games, an occasional round of golf, and guns. Lots of guns. Lots of ammunition. Lots of hours at the shooting range near their country home in Connecticut. Todd did not leave a note, a diary of his plans, or a video recorded manifesto like so many other mass shooters. But no explanation was really needed. Mental illness, social isolation, guns. All the ingredients in a familiar and deadly recipe. And then in the next news cycle, the photographs of the victims started to emerge. 13 lives lost, their faces and short bios filling half a page of the New York Times. A 46-year-old cancer researcher, a 21-year-old Korean exchange student, a 66-year-old Vietnam vet who'd survived Agent Orange, a 40-year-old teacher, a 10-year-old Alabama boy visiting the city for the first time. Todd had chosen them indiscriminately, white, brown, and black, male and female, young and old, rich and poor, a small but representative New York City melting pot, their fates bound together only by the misfortune of being within a bullet's reach from Todd that horrible morning. My gaze had circled back to the photograph of the teacher. I froze at the immediate recognition, but checked the name anyway. Molly Harris, 40, New York City, substitute teacher. The text beneath the photograph read. I had seen her face on Melissa's refrigerator for more than a decade's worth of Decembers. Jack, Molly, their daughter, Buckley, moving from baby to toddler to girl to tween. I scoured the internet, rereading the media coverage with a new focus. According to multiple survivors, a middle-aged woman in a blue dress was seen speaking to Todd right before she became the first of his victims. Todd froze as the woman fell to the ground. Some witnesses said that his face was so distraught that they failed to notice the gun in his hand. Then the pause was over and he began shooting. A Daily News article identified the woman in the blue dress as a mother and teacher. Quote, those who knew the woman have suggested that in light of her training in how to respond to school violence, she may have tried to talk him out of his deadly intentions. I re-examined the New York Times Tribune. Molly had been the only teacher. Instead of running or ducking, Jack's wife had died trying to save complete strangers. Within weeks, it wasn't just the faces of the slain on news pages and television stations. Family members came forward to speak of their loved ones. From a shared and unwanted bully pulpit, they called for reforms like increased security on mass transit, better mental health services, and increased regulation of firearms. And some were even willing to say aloud what many had been wondering from the beginning. What the hell was that father thinking? And then a year ago, after train ridership had returned to pre-shooting levels and victims' names began to fade from public consciousness, those survivors, led by the husband of the heroic teacher, went further and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the shooter's father, just before the statute of limitations was set to run. Last month, newspapers barely noticed when a New York County judge dismissed the family's lawsuit for failure to state a claim. And now this morning, the city had suffered another report of shots fired, followed again by terrified New Yorkers fleeing for safety. And once again, this time, not everyone had made it out alive. Only 3 dead, not 13. But for immediate purposes, what mattered most was the identity of one of the 3, Malcolm Neely. I didn't need to do any research to know that Malcolm Neely had been a multimillionaire, an investment banker to some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world. He was the kind of rich that made celebrities look poor. Yet few people knew his name until his 15-year-old son, Todd, opened fire in Penn Station, killing 13 people and wounding 8 others. He had made it through the wrongful death lawsuit only to be killed this morning. And now the hero teacher's husband was in custody, and the closest thing he had to an alibi was a woman he didn't even know. So from there, Olivia tries to help Jack prove that he's innocent. And then she starts to wonder if he really is or not.
Yeah, so everyone, if you are looking for a good crime thriller, whodunit, this would be the one to look at. Go get Alafair's book, The X, and find out what happens. Does Olivia actually get him exonerated or not? I'm sure there are lots of twists and turns because Alafair is famous for that. Now, thanks for sharing that very powerful chapter from The Axe, which touches on the ongoing debate about the link between toxic masculinity, mass shootings, and violence against women. So we've, here on the Pixel Project, we've previously discussed the issue of toxic masculinity with other Read for Pixels authors such as Ken Liu and Steven Erikson, both of whom have addressed the symptoms and consequences of such destructive machismo and misogyny on women and children and the wider community through their books and characters. So when you wrote this chapter, was it a deliberate choice on your part to directly address toxic masculinity and the violence, pain, and havoc it brings, including violence against women?
Yeah, well, most of my books they wind up touching on social problems that I sometimes don't know I'm wandering into, but that's where my mind lives as a citizen of the world, but also as a law professor and a former prosecutor and as a feminist. And so those are the ideas that I think about, and they find a way to kind of creep into my book, sometimes unwittingly. With that particular, I kind of wandered into the touchy and sensitive arena of mass shootings because I had this plot in mind of a woman who's pulled into the present life of her ex. You know, many of us have that person that's in our past that you sometimes wonder about, and it doesn't even seem real that you were ever that close to a person because they're so far in your past. And I thought, well, what would it be like if you got pulled back into that person's present life as their last hope? And so I started playing with that idea, and I said, okay, so her ex-fiance will get accused of something really bad. And it has to be something that over time she starts to wonder, maybe he really did do this. Maybe he's a good person and yet did this horrible thing. So I started playing with ideas, because in my books, it's usually not people who are 100% good and 100% bad. A lot of the crimes in my books are situational. They're either normal or good people pulled into situations that spiral out of control. And so I kind of thought, well, is there a situation where a really good person might do something so terrible? And so I started to wonder what could foster that kind of hatred in an otherwise good person. And so meanwhile, I look around the newspaper and you see all of these mass shootings that seem, in hindsight at least, to be preventable. And I thought, I might, maybe that's what it is Jack loses the person he loved the most in this utterly preventable, in his mind, mass shooting, and becomes obsessed himself with justice. Did he do it, or instead was he set up? So I kind of used that to get into the mystery, but it was also an opportunity for me to spend, just a few pages saying this is a massive public health problem, and we seem to be ignoring it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, violence against women is a massive public health issue, which is an angle that not many people think about. But organizations like UN Women does classify as violence against as a public health issue, and it's. I mean, you've done the research into mass shootings, and the one thing that stands out is that like 99% of mass shooters are young males. There may be one or two females, but they're mostly young males, and they're so angry
and looking for control and power, and it's the same kinds of factors that lead to domestic violence on a smaller scale.
Yeah, and there was an infamous one. I think in the last about 2 years ago, where this guy in California, I think he was so enraged by being rejected by women, well, in his mind anyway, and he started just just letting loose on all, driving by a bunch of college girls and just letting it rip at them. And and what's interesting is in that chapter, you also did a really neat nutshell of how toxic masculinity just gets transmitted from father to son. He's taking his Todd to teach him how to shoot guns and all. There's no indication at all that he's taught his son to manage his grief over his mother in any constructive way. And
right. She learns more about it as she investigates that the father pressured Todd to, man up and to not be such a wuss, and berated him for not being better at sports, and that really wanted this boy to be a certain type of man, and this was the boy's way of trying to do that.
Yeah, and it is something, I think it is something that people need to consider, and there's a lot of conversation about that in the anti-violence against women circles, especially with male allies, people like the White Ribbon Campaign. They work on dismantling that sort of socialization of boys, because they reckon that we can prevent, and we reckon too that we can prevent a lot of domestic violence and rapes and sexual assaults by dismantling toxic masculinity like that. That men, you can't express a lot of boys are not taught to express their feelings, and the major feeling that comes out of them is anger. The major reaction they have to a whole range of stuff, of happenings in their life, is anger, and that sort of comes out like that. And your book does a really, really good job of sort of setting it all out, even in that chapter. So the next question we have is, many people in the anti-violence against women movement say that male violence or male pattern violence is the main, if not the root cause of violence against women and girls, and of violence in general. So how do you think stories like yours can help move this conversation forward in a constructive way?
You know, I think that, you know, crime fiction, most people read it for entertainment. I mean, to be very honest, they want a good page turner, they want entertainment. But the highest, you know, the highest compliment I get from readers is that they learned something, or that it made them think about something, or to look at something in a different light. And I think that through pop culture and through arts and through crime fiction, writers are in a position to get people to look at crime, not just as entertainment, you know, not from this prurient perspective where it's, oh, you know, it's a serial killer and the cop is chasing the serial killer, and you don't even talk about the impact on women or the families who lose those women. So in my books, it's always important to me that if there's a life lost in a book, that there's time spent talking about who that person was and what the impact of that loss is to others, you know, to their families, to their friends, so that someone's life isn't just a plot point. And to the extent that books explore the reasons why people kill, or like I said, a lot of my books, it's situations that spiral out of control. It's getting people to kind of see that it's not just victims who are people, it's offenders too. They got there somehow.
Yeah, and we have to, I think, to get to the root of the problem, we have to understand what got them there, what got the offenders there, what conditioned them, how were they socialized, and we go from there, which is why I mentioned the White Ribbon Campaign, because they and a lot of other different organizations who focus on working with boys and young men to help, you know, to dismantle patriarchy. They talk a lot about trying to get to them before that sort of socialization takes place, and to replace it with something more constructive, more positive, better for men, better for everyone all around. Let's shift to talking about your female characters. So your two main female protagonists, Samantha Kincaid and ELLIE HATCHER, are fantastic female characters who are intelligent, resourceful, and skilled. They know what they are about and what they want, and they know how to get it. So first question, who or what inspired you to create Samantha and ELLIE? Where does the inspiration for the other female characters that populate the books come from too?
Yeah, I never thought I would be the author of 15 books, I guess now, something like that. I was one of those lawyers who thought I'd write one book. There's a lot of lawyers out there who's like, I think I could write a book. But I worked at the district attorney's office as a prosecutor in Portland, Oregon in the late 90s. And meanwhile, I was also reading a lot of crime fiction. So one of the things I would notice is I'd be reading a crime novel, and whenever a prosecutor or a district attorney showed up on the pages, I would get frustrated. I'd be like, that's not what our job is. You know, we do a lot more than just say objection and hearsay. And most of the time you're not even in court. You're working with witnesses and victims. You're meeting with schools to develop anti-crime programs. You're really doing a lot of stuff that, you know, fiction probably isn't going to talk about a lot. So I started thinking, well, what if I wrote a book featuring a prosecutor as the main character? And at the time, the only person who was really doing that was the wonderful Linda Fairstein, who is a New York prosecutor. And I said, well, you know, there might be room for one more book, and it'll be in Portland, not New York, so it'll be different. So I thought, I got an idea, and Samantha Kincaid, who's a prosecutor in Portland, kind of came out of that. And the basis for the book was actually somewhat kind of two real world cases kind of put together and then very much fictionalized. But I wanted her to kind of represent the best of what prosecutors do, which is use their discretion in ways that are just. And it wasn't my case, it was one of my friend's cases actually. And it was a sex offense against a teenage victim. And she initially lied not only to the police, but also to the prosecutor and the grand jury. She lied under oath about the circumstances under which she met the man who kidnapped and raped her. And, you know, she made it sound like it was a stranger abduction, when in reality she had met him online. She had agreed to meet him at the park, but then everything else happened the way she had said it was. And the prosecutor who was originally assigned the case was so mad that this teenage girl, you know, who'd been abused, he was so mad that she had lied under oath, and not admitted that she had initially agreed to meet him, that he was going to dismiss the case outright and just let this guy get away with it. And my friend, behind his back, basically took the case and prosecuted it and won. Got a confession. Eventually, the guy admitted his guilt, pled guilty, and went to prison for a long time. And the original prosecutor was so upset. It was like his personal ego was so upset. He couldn't get over it. And I thought, you know, that it kind of shows prosecutors at their best and their worst. So I kind of used that setup a bit for the first, what turned out to just be the first Samantha Kincaid book. So I wrote 3 of those. And then by that time I had been living in New York and wanted to try my hand at setting a book in New York. And Samantha couldn't really move to New York. That didn't make sense. So I came up with Detective Ellie Hatcher, and I've written 5 Ellie Hatcher books. So, but what they have in common, they're different in a lot of ways, but they're both women who work in dominated by men, right? They're kind of women and men work, and they bring that eye to their work. You know, they're both very committed to a sense of right and wrong.
Okay, so, you know, like any other genre, the detective/crime/mystery genre has its share of female stereotypes and tropes. So how do you work around or subvert such stereotypes to create female characters who have agency in dealing with the world around them, including sexism, misogyny, and violence against women?
Yeah, I think those days are over. I mean, I do think there was a time when, you know, when crime fiction was sort of dominated by certain male voices, where it was like the cool dude, you know, would always kind of save the damsel in distress, or they would be, you know, they'd fall head over heels with the dangerous, manipulative female, you know, those tropes. But I think some of the best crime fiction right now, and part of the kind of the new renaissance of crime fiction, is really because of women writing about women. And if you think about it, when men are more likely, when I don't want to be too broad brushstrokes here, I guess, but when men have involvement, if they're victims of crime or if they get involved in crime, it's often that they're the investigators, right? Or they are the saviors, right? They're the ones trying to protect somebody. With women, they're more likely to be, they're in danger because of their own lives. They're in danger because of the people close to them, not outsiders. It's people in their own homes that put them at risk. And I think that when women are writing about women experiencing crime, that changes the focus of it. It's not men out saving people outside their house. It's women finding danger from within. And I think that has kind of turned crime fiction a little bit on its head. And that seems to be what a lot of people want to read right now. In fact, there's an article that everybody's arguing about right now about men using women's names now to kind of position their books as if they're women writing about crime, because people finally noticed, like, hey, women bring a different eye to the genre than men. So now a bunch of men are like, hey, I'll just pretend to be a woman.
That's interesting, because I think a year or so ago, there was another article written by a female writer who did a little experiment. She sent her work in under her own name, and she barely got a look in from any publishers or agents. And then when she changed her name to a male name, suddenly, you know, they were banging down the door. So it's interesting that in crime fiction, this is happening. I think it's
yeah. For years, women were using initials. You know, they would use initials to seem either male or to not be overtly female. But now, because books by women are selling so well, it's reversed.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday. Yeah, this point is really interesting because yesterday we had a hangout, Read for Pixels hangout with Vicky Patterson, and she writes thrillers as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she was saying that, that one of the reasons why women can write crime fiction and thrillers so well, and horror, in fact, is because, I mean, look, we walk out the door and we get harassed on the street. At home, you never know who and 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending on the country, go home to an abusive spouse. So she said, just by the fact that we were born, that we're female,
yeah,
born into the system, the patriarchal system, with that just we're constantly having to look out for our own safety. So that's a perspective that female writers bring to crime and thrillers. Well, that's what she said. Yeah.
No, I think that's right, because I mean, I don't mean to say men are impervious to fears. They have fears like anyone has fears, but I think there's, when you're female, when you're a woman in this world, you have fears that are unique to women, and I think that that's showing up on the page of crime fiction right now.
Yeah, because it's like Margaret Atwood said, right? Men are afraid women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them, basically. Oh, so there are different subgenres in detective mystery and crime, in detective mystery and crime books, like noir, hard-boiled detective fiction, and hard-boiled detective fiction. They always seem so male dominated. Do you think women are also making inroads in those subgenres right now?
Yeah, there's a book. This is the advantage of being in my room right now. I can stand up and look at my nightstand really quickly because I'm forgetting her name. It's The Last Place You Look. I'm going to give her a shout out, and her name is Kristen Leopianka. I'm probably saying it wrong, but the title of it's The Last Place You Look. But I've met her in person, which is why I bought the book. I was very impressed by her first, and then I read the book. But her character is as hard-boiled of a private eye as you find anywhere else. But she's a young woman, but she takes the kind of the old detective novel and flips it on its head for this kind of young feminist bisexual character. And so, yeah, I really think women's fingerprints are kind of all over the genre right now.
Is there sort of like, when we talk to science fiction and fantasy authors, we talk about how it's still it's still geeks it's still sort of very misogynistic in a way. Women are told you're not real geeks, or we go to conventions and we get harassed. How is it in the in the crime genre? Is it crime fiction conventions and all? Is it 50-50, or is it still male dominated? Or
no, I've got to say, crime writers are a friendly lot. From my friends who are more literary tell me there's much more kind of feuding and infighting among the people who take themselves that seriously, I suppose. But crime fiction and thriller writers are really supportive of each other, and there's a couple big conferences a year. So I think the UK writers all kind of know each other, the American crime writers all kind of know each other, and some of us are lucky enough to kind of go both places and make friendships on both sides. But for the most part, you do occasionally. I think writers know better than to say it anymore. Whether they're thinking about it, I like to think they're not even thinking it. But you will actually hear readers say, I don't read women, or I don't like books written by women. And a lot of times it's female readers. So what are you going to do, I suppose? It's you occasionally hear a comment of like, women only write fluff, but I think right now, you look at what everyone's writing, who's getting nominated. I mean, women still don't get nominated for their fair share of awards, but more and more women are getting nominated for like the big crime fiction awards and are selling a lot of books to the point that men are using their names now. So, there's people, you do the good work and eventually it becomes undeniable. So, you know, maybe it's coming too late, but I think right now there's a lot of women at the top of their game right now.
Which I feel is a little bit ironic because the queen of mystery is Agatha Christie, and she's still the best-selling author in the entire world. And yeah, I love her books. She's got a mind like that does puzzles, and it's interesting to see that now men are trying to get in by using female.
I know, isn't it? But you know, men I've been very lucky. I mean, I've had a lot of mentors along the way, but 3 of my big mentors are Michael Connelly, Lee Child, and Harlan Coben, and they're like manly men. they've mentored a lot of young women writers, getting less young, but I mean they've brought a lot of women up behind them, and you know, so I think it's been very nice that way, and I think people are just getting the recognition. I'm lucky enough. I co-author with Mary Higgins Clark, Queen of Suspense, Mary Higgins Clark, and you know, a lot of people think of her books as kind of cozy, so-called cozies, and not being particularly gritty. If you look at her first book has children at risk. It's got psychological suspense. It's domestic suspense. I mean, it's everything that's bringing crime fiction kind of back right now. She was doing, you know, 40 years ago. So women are pretty good at this stuff.
Yeah, Mary Higgins Clark is awesome. I used to sneak her books when I was a teenager.
I know, and I read her books when I was a kid, and like it still freaks me out. I'm like, oh, I've got to go meet with Mary today to talk about the new book. So it's been quite a nice ride.
Yeah. Well, do you think, as a writer, do you think it's important to create female characters who are dominant personalities who can get things done? And how, and you know, what sort of reactions do people have to that? Do you get any pressure to make your characters more likable?
Oh, I love that question. So yeah, do women have to be likable? So I feel like, you know, maybe it was Gone Girl, you know, maybe was the most best-selling book that brought up this question of, does the female character have to be likable? I don't hear people saying that about other characters. You know, the early detective novels, you know, where these guys were drunks and they'd work their cases hungover, and you know, like nobody said, "Oh, do I like him? Would I want to have a cup of tea with him?" But I'm not sure what likable means, because you know, in the X, what I just read from, it's interesting because after writing, I think Ellie Hatcher and Samantha Kincaid are, I think most people call them likable female characters, the kind of people you do want, you know, to go have Chardonnay with, or you know, be a roommate with. But with Olivia Randall, the defense attorney, in the very first scene, she's lying to her boss. She's in bed with someone else's husband, and some people, like when I went out on book tour, they're like, "Oh, you know, this is the first time you've written an unlikable female protagonist," and I was like, "Is she unlikable?" I'm like, I don't think so. Like, I would be friends with her. I would say stop sleeping with people's husbands and maybe drink a little less and don't lie so much. But to me, I find her quite likable. So sometimes I think likable is code for perfect, that female characters are supposed to be unflawed, or if they're flawed, they're supposed to fix themselves. They can't just have flaws. So I never know what that means. I find all of my characters likable, I suppose. So.
Yeah, we chatted with Ilona Andrews earlier this weekend, and something Ilona said was very striking, and I'm wondering if it also applies to crime fiction. She said that she noticed that you can have the big alpha male and he can do any sort of horrible thing, and the reader will forgive him. But with female characters, it's not that easy.
Right.
It's not easy.
Yeah,
they need some sort of what did she say? Let me. She said that with female characters, readers aren't so forgiving as they are with male characters. Do you find that in the
I
same?
never thought about that, but I could see that it's a, yeah, they're more willing to take rough edges on and flaws in male characters. I could imagine that's right without kind of thinking it through. I'm trying to imagine a female Jack Reacher, you know. I don't know if people, you know, you just a woman who runs around is betting people all over the world while taking names. I don't know if that would work.
I don't think so. I mean, I love the Jack Reacher books, and Lee Child actually donated some stuff for us last year. He's really nice. He couldn't make it for a hangout, but you know, the thing about Jack Reacher is that you just on a little, you know, just circling back to toxic masculinity, he is the epitome of the big alpha male, but but you know, in the first Jack Reacher book itself, you know, we know that what he stands for, he will not stand for rape, he will not stand for sexual assault, he always gets consent, you know, he handles, you know, and he understands why there's, I can't remember which book it was that he was helping a woman who is experiencing domestic violence, and he solves the case. And you know, there is no sentimental my tongue today, sentimentality, yeah, no sentimentality about it, but he just goes and does it. And that moral code that he has is it's very strong, and he doesn't hurt women and children.
No, and in fact, it's often how he gets himself in trouble is for trying to correct a man who is picking on someone that he shouldn't be picking on. But also, even in institutional settings, if he's in a room with, you know, 15 cops and he's trying to figure out which one he thinks is smartest or which one he can trust, it's usually the woman.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
He's worked with so many women. So that was what, and you know, a lot of women do read the Jack Reacher books, and I think that's why, you know, you don't want to read about out and out alpha male toxic masculinity. You want
one of the big newspapers, I don't know if it was the Wall Street Journal or the Post or the Times, one of those three big papers did a big feature of why women like Jack Reacher. And it's the same kind of observations, that he really is a feminist at heart.
Yeah, and so I mean, going back to women, you know, there's certain times when Ellie and Samantha have to behave in what some people would label, quote unquote, stereotypically feminine ways to get things done, such as smiling and flirting with a male official. And this may be seen as somewhat unfeminist behavior and an erosion of the character's strength, or perhaps even manipulative. What is your opinion on this?
You know, I think for Ellie and Samantha, what they would say, it's about getting their job done. It's not to get a promotion. It's not to avoid a confrontation. It's not to take the easy way out. They're trying to help someone else, or they're trying to get an answer, and this person is in their way, and the way they can diffuse that person, the way they can get the person out of their way, is to smile, give them what they want, say a little joke, soften up a little bit, get what they want from them, and get out of there. And so I don't judge that. I don't see that as a misuse of, you know, if you're gonna, yeah, I mean, I see women manage the workplace that way every day, you know, and sometimes you make a different call, but sometimes you do what's going to get the answer fastest, or you've got to stay on mission, right? So if your mission is this and this person's in your way, you can come back and deal with them later, but it's about getting the job done. So I think that, and they both know that, and they don't like it, but that's how they get their job done. And I think women make those choices all the time.
Yeah, I don't think it's a reflection on them. It's probably more accurate to say it's a reflection on the men and the people that they're dealing with, that they have to pander to that. I think it's a reflection of society as a whole, that it hasn't gotten to a place where we can get things done by using plain speaking.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, there's a question from the audience. From Anusha, are there any scenarios in your books that you took from real life, something that you actually experienced in your work as an attorney?
Yeah, I mean, the Samantha Kincaid books really are, when I go back and look at those books, it's almost like I'm back in Portland, you know, as a young lawyer, kind of navigating that world, which can be highly politicized. It can also be a place where you find very good friends. I'm friends with those people to this day. So just the culture of that office and the culture of law enforcement. I worked out of a police precinct for 2 years. And so I just think the depiction of the actual world, the way the characters speak to each other, the dynamics, somewhat unexpected dynamics that a cop talks to a judge differently than to a witness, than to a prosecutor, and vice versa. All of that comes from my experience. Cases, fictionalized versions of cases I handled appear in my books. Sometimes it's little anecdotes, you know, Ellie will have handled some little case, or here's a story about something. And a lot of the smaller anecdotes, not the main cases, are stuff that came from practice. So yeah, I mine those things. I think writers mine the world constantly for material. So certainly the stuff I did as a lawyer has worked its way into my book.
Yeah. Oh, and Anusha has a remark. She says about, you know, pandering, you know, being feminine, pandering to the guys. She says, I've done that so many times. Smile at them to get stuff done.
Like, yeah, you walk away and they're like, they just don't even know that they agreed what they just agreed to. Yeah. I mean, I guess I draw a distinction between if you do that at the expense, if you're doing it for personal promotion, that can be at the expense of other women. You know, that is kind of trying to get ahead in ways that are not particularly valid. But if it's a question of, I just need this person to cooperate with me because I am trying to get something done, I guess I consider that different.
Yeah, I mean, I do it too. You know, I keep reminding myself, you know, a spoonful of sugar is better than a sledgehammer.
I like that better than you get more with honey. Look, the reality is people, to get stuff done, you want people to want to help you. They want to help you and they like you. And we've been talking about what makes women likable. And part of what makes women likable is if you're friendly and approachable and not threatening. And, you know, that's the reality. That's probably true for men too. I don't think people want to help men and go around yelling and screaming.
Yeah, I mean, but men have more leeway, you know, for you know, being rude or just plain speaking or demanding things, whereas we get called the B word if people feel that we are too demanding, too in your face. But the same behavior in a male, in a man, it gets a very, very different reception. Yeah. So let's move on to, you know, you were a prosecutor and you worked on, you know, prosecuting domestic violence offenses back in Portland. And, you know, the general consensus of domestic violence survivors, activists, and advocates is that the legal system, not just in the U.S., but, you know, let's talk about U.S. since you've been a prosecutor in the U.S., but worldwide as well. You know, you say the legal system fails victims and survivors more often than not, sometimes fatally. Based on your experience with prosecuting domestic violence cases, what do you think needs to be done to address the failures of the system? Not asking you to go into detail, but, you know, any general ideas, things that people can do?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those, I have very conflicted ideas about this. It's because what I want to say, of course, is that the system probably needs to listen more to women. Know when they're in danger, and the system should listen to them when they say, for you to prosecute this case is going to put me in danger, or for me to get a restraining order is going to make things worse. It's almost like what we were talking about, the odd analogy to make, but sometimes you know that the way to get your job done is to smile and keep your head down. Sometimes somebody knows, if I get a restraining order or I sign that complaint, it's gonna be worse, and the system needs to take that into account. The problem is, when the system used to take that into account, women would get pressured not to prosecute and to not get restraining orders, and police would not respond, and they would just treat it as a purely private matter. So to kind of get away from the model of violence in the home isn't really a crime, a lot of offices have, I'm sure you know this, but in the United States, most jurisdictions have mandatory arrest laws. So over the woman's objection, he's arrested. And then many offices, including the one I worked in, would even prosecute over their objections. And I see the merit in that. And then sometimes it's helping and sometimes it's making things worse. So, part of the problem is, some of the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when the woman leaves. And that's a triggering event that's always going to be explosive. They never just say, oh, okay, I guess you're leaving me. That's always going to be a dangerous period of time. And the question is, short of 24/7 bodyguards, how do you keep someone safe during that time? And restraining orders are supposed to make the situation safer, but it can actually prove to be quite explosive.
Yeah, it's the first 6 months. That's what the research shows. It's the first 6 months after she leaves, because domestic violence is all about control. And when she leaves, he has lost control. And and it's also why domestic violence shelters are in anonymous locations. No one, we might know the main office for the domestic violence agency, but the actual shelters are somewhere where nobody knows where it is, so that the abuser can't weasel it out of anybody. Right. And even after 6 months, this is still the danger zone. After 6 months, unless she really moves away. In some cases, if they're able to, they will move away. If they don't have kids, if they have kids and pets, it gets more complicated. Yeah, so there's still plenty of people battling their way through court, getting restraining orders. And the saddest cases, I don't know if you've worked in any of these, are when the mom is applying for sole custody of the kids, but the judge awards joint custody or gives the custody of the kids to the abuser. I mean, have you been in these cases, this sort of case before?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's because you can't disentangle. How do you get away with someone that you have to co-parent with?
Yeah. So, what do you think can be done about it when, the law says, parents have equal rights, both parents, but obviously, very obviously, one of them, usually the male, is abusive.
I mean, the judges, at least in the United States, it's very hard to terminate someone's parental rights. They don't lose their children. I mean, O.J. Simpson didn't even, lose his children, even despite a civil finding that he had killed their mother. So I don't know how unless crimes against the mother are treated as crimes against the children, that's why that situation exists. They can do horrible things to the mother, and it doesn't affect the way their relationship with the children is the fiction. The fiction of it is that there's something separate.
Yeah. So, what would be your general advice to victims who do decide to pursue their case through the justice system?
At least in the States, many offices have victims advocates that are separate from the police and separate from the prosecution, so that there's a bit of a buffer there, so that they don't necessarily have a law enforcement objective. They're meant purely to be the victims advocates, and they can help them navigate through the system, because they'll have one option is to stay completely out of the court system altogether. One is to just get a civil restraining order. One is just to pursue family court to try to get separation and the children's situation worked out. and then the other is to do criminal prosecution. I would find out before criminal prosecution what the sentencing options are and how much the victim's input counts into that. So, for example, where I practiced, we had a deferral program where people so that if victims went through the criminal prosecution, one possibility was that the defendant didn't necessarily take a criminal conviction, got anger management counseling, agreed to a restraining order, agreed to monitoring, those kinds of things, and went through a kind of an intensive counseling class that could last, 6 months to a year. And we found that to actually be fairly effective, because sometimes if the offender loses his job and goes to jail, sometimes that puts the whole family in a worse position. So, I mean, I think part of it is women getting informed about what the options are, so they feel some kind of power over the situation of being able to figure out what's right for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So before we move on to the next phase of the discussion, there's a question from viewer Ira B1. Ira says, who do you like better, Ellie or Samantha? And which villain you like the least, or who creeped you out the most?
Well, that's a good question. Who do I like better? I like writing Ellie better, because I just think as a detective, she's not confined to the job of a prosecutor. She has a little more leeway as an investigator, and I like her New York setting and her brother and all of that. In terms of like who would probably be someone that I would hang around with, and I think of Samantha Kincaid as she could be any one of my friends, I feel like. So I like her a lot. She's near and dear to me. The killer in Angel's Tip, to me, is probably the scariest killer I've ever created fictionally. I think that's who creeped me out the most.
So when we have authors horror authors who say, when they write a particular scene and they know that they've done a really good job if they creep themselves out. I mean, is it the same for you?
Yes, I have because my husband's like a nice normal guy. We have dogs. Like our house, this house is not a morbid place. But I'll go into my office and I'll come out like after having worked for a long time, and I'll be like, if you saw what I wrote just now, like you would be afraid of me. And like, whoa, where did that come from? With some, I've more recently, I'm reworking a short story I wrote several years ago, and I found myself actually wanting to kind of make it a little less creepy, because it was like almost too creepy.
Do you test your stories out on your husband? Like, read this and see if you're creeped out?
No. No. My editor, she's my creep factor. She'll be like, no.
You have to wonder about crime editors who edit crime and horror fiction, and see how much it would take to creep them out. I guess.
Yeah, I think they've got pretty thick skin. So.
Yeah. So let's move on. I mean, we're almost to the end, so we're going to talk about storytelling, and then we'll wrap up. So how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about sexism and violence against women and telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Yeah. I really do I seek to entertain, but I want to do it in a way that I feel is responsible. So my number one goal is not to educate or to make a social point. But the things that I find interesting, though, tend to be grounded in some kind of social setting, right? I mean, if the crime is realistic, it means that it's somewhere out there in the world. It's not like aliens suddenly coming down from space. I mean, this is the stuff I write about is stuff that actually happens. And I think that automatically grounds it in many of the issues that we've been talking about tonight. So I try to deal with those responsibly, which I think is different than I'm going to, you know, make sure that when people read this book, they've learned something. Like I said, a great compliment to me is the number of people who say like her books do have a message, or I do always wind up learning something, or it makes me see something in a different light. You know, another thing is just making sure characters are diverse, for example. How can I write a book in New York where everybody's white? How can I write a book where no one's gay or bi or trans? And that's part of, it's not to make a point, you know, it's not like, oh, she's got an agenda. It's grounding your stories in the real world. And so I think in a way they wind up going together. There's not really a conflict between the two.
Okay, so you know, the very nature of crime novels means that they'll feature all sorts of violence and sometimes violence against women. How do you find the balance between showing that violence is an integral part of the story and, you know, not showing violence gratuitously?
Yeah. I don't have very much violence on the page. So even though I've read something about a mass shooting, it's something that has already taken place. Mm-hmm. It's not being talked about in the present, not happening to people on the page. And I don't write about violence in what I think of as a gory way. It tends to be represented almost in a clinical, distanced way, kind of after the fact, by investigators, by people who who can talk about it in sort of a matter-of-fact way. And if I feel like something's prurient, I take it out. You know, if I think someone would find it thrilling, I take it out. That's my comfort level with it. Other people deal with it quite differently, but you know, I tend to avoid graphic violence on the page.
Yeah. So, you know, and I'm going to ask you a question that has divided authors ever since we started asking this question, which is, let's see, do you think it's important for influential authors such as yourself to make a conscious effort to include characters in your stories that show readers the importance of respecting women as equals and as human beings? Now, we have two camps. One camp says the character is going to do what the character is going to do. The other camp says, yes, I don't care, I'm going to stick that in, and because it is important to help readers envision a better world. So which camp do you fall into, or do you fall into somewhere in between?
It's always in my nature to say I'm somewhere in between. I'm the ultimate centrist. But no, I think it goes back to, I want my books to feel real. And so, you know, I've got characters in my books who are sexist and misogynist, who aren't 100% bad. That's just their worldview. But I like to think I'm writing about them in a way where people will at least recognize, like, oh, that guy's kind of a jerk when it comes to that. And then I have, you know, not every woman in my books is strong. The most well-known series characters are, but, you know, I've written about some fairly passive women. Yeah, I feel like when I have a sense of what is, I guess I'm more on the side of the characters are going to do what the characters are going to do, but because I think I write about the world and people are quite different in the world, I don't feel like my characters are either one or the other. You know, I feel like I've got a good blend of characters.
Okay, so final questions to wrap up. Oh no, there's one more. Sorry, I missed one. So the final question on storytelling anyway. How do you think authors can tackle the issue of violence against women without falling back on harmful stereotypes and tropes? Because there has been a lot of discussion about, you know, using rape as a lazy plot device to, you know, to justify what they call man tears, you know, so that, for example, if the male character, you know, his wife gets raped, and so he goes on a rampage, and the wife's rape is just used to justify him going on a rampage. So how do you avoid stereotypes and tropes like that?
Again, I've got my certain rules. So I I really like my one rule. I've got a lot of rules, but if there's violence against anyone in my books, and it is oftentimes against women, it needs to be for a reason, and it needs to, the reader has to know what was at stake. It can't just be a plot point. It has to feel real. It has to feel like that is a real person, and this is how she was affected by it. And I feel like if I follow that rule, I feel like it keeps me from subconsciously kind of taking those kind of lazy shortcuts. Yeah.
Yeah, because all your books are in a sense of a story about the fallout, the consequences of the violence, and what happens after the violence. And it puts a lot of, it helps with context. And I guess I understand what you're saying, where you have to show context around it. And if you don't, then that's, am I correct that you have to show context? Otherwise, it just becomes a plot point.
Yeah, it can't just, I mean, I guess I'm thinking of all set up the straw man, like the type of book I'm thinking of that I wouldn't want to write is a serial killer novel where the two main characters are the male serial killer and the male detective, and the women who appear they just die one after the next, victim 1, victim 2, victim 3, like they're pieces of evidence. I feel like that I would not want to write a book like that. So that's why I'm saying that even when someone's alive only briefly on the page, I want the reader to know that they are real, and remember, they need to be a real character. They need to feel like an actual human being.
Yeah. Okay, right. Final questions. So you have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So why do you support the cause to end violence against women? And in your opinion, how can authors like yourself best support efforts to kick off social change to end violence against women?
Oh boy. I mean, much of what I've done my whole life, I've always been a feminist. I've worked for feminist causes. When I was a prosecutor, I worked on domestic violence cases. I've written about violence against women as a law professor. Even in fiction, I write about women in men's worlds and the adverse consequences that can come to women who rock the boat too hard. So I continue. It was an easy invitation for me to accept when you asked me if I could help. And I think, writers have a platform. Anybody who's lucky enough to have a platform should choose how to use it and promote the causes that are important to us, because as much as we seek to entertain, what do they say, with power comes great responsibility, or something like that. I feel like, particularly in the world we live in right now, if you're lucky enough to have a few hundred people willing to hear you out about stuff, you have a responsibility to speak up.
All right, so we've come to the end. I'm just going to share a little slide with everyone who's watching right now. So I'll put myself back on screen. Hi guys, I'm back. Yeah, if you've been watching, oops.
Sorry, my computer got a phone call. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was wondering, ooh, what was that? Was that me? So, as mentioned earlier, Alafair had donated a wonderful goodie bundle with five of her books signed by her and Mystery Writers of America tote bag, and that has been picked up by Faith Hu from Massachusetts. But there are still plenty more author goodies available for authors including Charles de Lind, Karen Rose, Eliette de Bodard, Ken Liu, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Jean-Pierre Valentine, Isaac Marion, and more. And we'll be releasing the goodies in weekly batches, so check back on Fridays throughout September for new goodies going up. And some of the goodies are available for US donors only, while others are for donors worldwide. So check before you select your goodie of choice, before you make your donation. And let's put this on screen so we can show you where you can go. Do you see the?
Oh yeah, look at.
Yeah. So if you want to donate to get these goodies, go to is.gd/R4P Rally Up. 2017. And if you want to learn more about the Read for Pixels campaign, where we work with, collaborate with authors like Alafair to raise awareness about violence against women, to get the conversation going, and to raise funds to keep all the work that we do going, go to is.gd/readforpixels. And to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. And if you want to find out more about the celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign, please visit reveal.thepixelproject.net to learn more about it and to generously donate to help us raise $1 million for the cause. Now I'm gonna put Alafair back on screen. Alafair, do you have any announcements to make before we sign off?
I hope people will, in addition to donating for the Pixel Project, keep in mind the victims of the current storms and think of them and help them. We all need to be kind to each other these days. It's been a hard week. You probably mentioned I promote my books. I also have new books coming out in November and January.
Yeah, you got a new book coming out in November?
Mary Higgins Clark and I have a book out in November called Every Breath You Take. And then my next book comes out January 23rd and it's called The Wife.
Oh, awesome. So everyone who's watching this, please watch out for the announcements. Alafair has a page on Facebook. I think you'll be making the announcement there, right? Once the book is out.
Yes, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
Yeah, so now Alafair and I will bid you both, bid you all good night. And thank you so much for spending the last hour or so with us. And like I said, if you need any help, if you need help getting started, helping your friends who are in domestic violence situations or experiencing or who have experienced rape and sexual assault, please go to thepixelproject.net. So thank you and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Regina, so much for this.